This is Anthony from MakeWeirdMusic.com, and I'm here with Homer Flynn. Homer, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure.
Really
Yeah.
appreciate
Hi,
it.
Anthony. Hi.
Can you tell us who you are and what you do?
Yes, my name is Homer Flynn. I am one of the owners of the Cryptic Corporation. The Cryptic Corporation is the managers, handlers, PR interface for the residents. The residents are an art, music, and performance collective in San Francisco since 1972.
And how has the band, what's unique about the band? I mean, there's a movie called Theory of Obscurity, and it's primarily about the residents and their history, but...
Well, I suppose the most unique thing about the residents is that they have chosen to present themselves as a sort of faceless facade. The group members have never been identified. They've never actually shown their faces. No one really knows if it's the same people now that it was in 1972. And as far as the residents are concerned, that's not really important.
And they have quite a storied history, and going from playing in a small shop to touring the world. Can you tell us about kind of the evolution of their growth?
Well, that's
It's a big story.
That's,
It's 40
yeah,
some
that's a
years.
big question. Yeah, right, exactly. Once again, they've been doing this since '72, so a lot of their evolution, I suppose, they started out really sort of as the ultimate studio group. They didn't tour, they didn't perform live for the first 10 years. And they were very influenced by people like Frank Zappa, people who used the studio really as a tool, as another instrument. And really they came at it more from a point of view of non-musicians. They had an attitude that they learned to play something just well enough to get it recorded, and then they would record it and they'd never play that again. And which is pretty much the opposite from a band, a normal band where you get several people together, they all practice and practice until they get to the point to where they can play a song or a series of songs well together.
Right.
The residents never did that. So that kind of put them, in their own space,
Right.
more or less, from the beginning. There was interest in them playing live, but they felt like their studio sound was so. Again, it was a very complex sound. It wasn't complex because they were great musicians. It was because of the layering that they would create with their recording techniques, and it was such an interesting and unique sound. They felt like people would be disappointed if they couldn't recreate that live.
Right.
So for the first 10 years, they didn't play. All they did was record. And then with the invention of samplers, at least on a broad level, the first thing being emulators back in the early 80s, at that point they started to feel like, well, maybe they could recreate their studio sound to some extent, and that's when they first started touring. Another thing about the residents is that they've always felt that the visual side of their work was equal in many ways to the music side from the point of view of how they valued it. And so they were very early doing music videos. I'm the person who's done a lot of their album covers, most of their album covers, and they always felt that the album covers were very important in terms of, getting some sort of signal as to what this project was all about.
Right.
So once again, they started touring in the 80s. They did 3 tours in the 80s. They began to computerize in the early 90s when they first started doing MIDI. MIDI, of course, kind of took the real-time element out of music for them.
Right.
And in a lot of ways, they weren't great musicians, so that just made things a little easier or certainly more flexible.
Yeah.
And then In the 90s, they were very involved in CD-ROMs. They put out 3 CD-ROMs that were very well accepted, and they were so much working on that kind of material. So anyway, in the 90s, the Residents virtually did not perform at all. They were involved in CD-ROM projects. That world kind of went away, and then they started touring again in the late 90s, and had been touring fairly regularly ever since. Although, once again, things continue to change and evolve, and their performance stuff, the Residents really do performance art. They're not really a band playing songs.
Right.
So what they do is really very theatrical. But in some ways, as things come full circle or whatever, the kind of shows that they're doing now are really kind of more band oriented. I mean, in some ways, the version of the Residents that exists now is called Randy, Chuck, and Bob, and Randy, Chuck, and Bob have been referred to as the world's greatest Residents cover band. So anyway, that's a sort of
that's wonderful.
Capsule summary of 40 years.
Well, it's interesting. You had mentioned the Residents didn't tour until they were able to replicate some of their sound live.
Right.
However, now these covers, by Randy, Chuck, and Bob, these performances are so different from a lot of the original songs.
Right.
Was that a matter of maturity, growth, confidence, or was that it's just a different era of the band?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, honestly, maturity, growth, confidence is probably hitting it pretty closely. When they first started contemplating touring in the early 80s, they didn't have any confidence in what they were doing. They really felt like, which is not to dismiss what they did at that time,
right.
But at the same time, they kind of felt like they needed a certain amount of smoke and mirrors. And when they took their first show out, which was the Mole Show in '82, I think, they had 20 gigantic backdrops. The backdrops, they were 20 feet tall and 10 feet wide, I think. And it took them literally 4 to 5 hours to set up just the backdrops before every show. And that tour lost anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000, depending on whose accounting you went by, and you were lucky if you got any accounting from anybody.
Yeah.
It was a complete and total disaster. And ultimately, as their confidence and maturity has grown, they've become much more efficient about what they do. And ultimately, I think that efficiency pays off.
How about you as an artist? Your art has evolved quite a bit. Did you go through similar stages of development? Through, as you worked alongside the Residents, were you going through something similar?
Sure, I would say so.
Yeah.
My own evolution, I try to do things a lot simpler now than what I used to. I used to feel like things needed to be very kind of busy and complicated. But once again, that also has to do with the evolution and changes in the technology and the culture.
The efficiency of the tools, too.
And the efficiency of the tools. But it used to be that, when you did a primary graphic for an album, that was an album cover. It was 12 by 12. You had a lot of space there to fill up. Now, ultimately, your primary graphic or your marketing tool is something that's going to be maybe 2 inches by 2 inches and show up on iTunes.
Right.
I mean, you better be pretty economical with that.
That's right. Yeah.
So once again, all these things have changed and evolved, and if anything, what I've learned over the years is that you have to learn how to surf the changes. You can't fight the changes.
Interesting. So speaking of which, the music industry has completely changed. The way people participate with music and art has completely changed. What are some of your thoughts on the way people do that now, as opposed to maybe in the 70s when it seems like maybe there was an artistic prime in these kinds of industries where tech wasn't invading everything?
Well, I have mixed feelings about all that. I mean, in some ways, I can understand what you're saying. On the other hand, I see where tech has actually opened the doors wider open than ever. And at this point in time, anybody with a laptop, if not a phone, you know, not only has musical instruments, but they have a studio right there. And ultimately, I could sit here at this table in this coffee shop, and I could create a song on my phone. I could post it on SoundCloud, and I could have something up and out for people to consume within an hour.
No record companies.
Were I so inclined.
Right.
And I think that's great. I think it's great. On the other hand, by the same token, there's a massive amount of garbage out there.
Yeah.
And if you are a consumer, weeding your way through all of that garbage, it can be pretty daunting. It used to be when I was young, I'd go to a record store, and you know, you'd thumb through some albums. If a cover caught your fancy, or you know, maybe somebody would play a little bit of it for you. Once again, the choices were a lot simpler. The times were a lot simpler. But again, you know, you surf the changes. You don't fight the changes. And I try to find what I feel like is the good part of the way things have changed.
As you're looking around the music industry or art today, like you said, there's a lot of garbage. Are there any great artists that you admire, whether in visual, graphic design, or in music? Anyone that you're looking at thinking they're doing it differently, like the Residents have been doing it differently?
Well, it's hard to find anybody that I can compare to the Residents. I mean,
Yeah.
the Residents are still pretty unique, even though in a lot of ways, you know, the Residents are not as out at this point as what they were, you know, in the mid-'70s, say. There is no the basis of comparison, or there was no basis of comparison at that point. You can actually kind of compare the Residents to some extent now. But I certainly seek out new music and find stuff that I like. There's a group, a Finnish group called Amelman Vasarat, and I'm an eMusic subscriber, and so, you know, with eMusic I pay $14 a month subscription, and you download, and it's like a use it or lose it deal. So if you don't do it, you don't get them, and that forces me to download new music. And so this group, I think it was just something that was recommended to me on eMusic, and it's a fairly large group, 7 or 8 pieces, maybe 9 pieces, with horns, and they were kind of lumped in with Eastern European music, but they're kind of like almost like a kind of punk jazz fusion that I find very unique and very compelling. Something else that I just downloaded from eMusic. You know, sometimes my deadline is coming, so I get desperate. I have to download something. So I discovered these Russian a cappella recordings. And God, they must have 20 albums out. It's called something dumb like Free and Easy or Sweet and Jazzy, I don't know. But they had one entire album of Wacky Michael Jackson covers, and they had this great version of Billie Jean that I just popped up on my iTunes yesterday. So anyway, I mean, the point is, I still think there's a lot of interesting music being created because the tools are so fantastic.
Right.
But at the same time, you have to work hard to find it.
Right. So the residents in their early stages seem to be pretty rebellious, maybe even politically motivated in some senses, Third Reich and roll, like there's some controversy there. But now it seems to be more just thematically weird. The music has evolved over time, and obviously not running out of things to say, but like you said, they were incomparable at the time, and now they're more comparable to music.
Right.
Is that because the rest of the groups out there have caught up?
I think the culture has caught up to the residents to some extent.
Yeah.
I do. I mean, you know, the residents are older at this point.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there's two things there. It's kind of hard to keep charging ahead like you're in your 20s or early 30s.
Right.
And at the same time, I don't think they feel the necessity of having to do that
Right.
as much now as they did then.
Yeah.
So I think you have both of those things working.
A lot of the themes, or the lyrics and music are fairly dark for the residents. I'd say it's pretty dark. There's a lot of dark music in their catalog. Is there something motivating that? Is it just fun and weird for them, or how do they think of a story about a deranged clown like Tweedles or animal lover? Like, where do these themes come from, and how do they motivate the music?
Well, I mean, you're correct that those things, there's a certain dark aspect to those. From my own perspective, they're just sort of reflecting life as they see it. I mean, because there's also a lot of humor in those exact same things. And so they try to balance out the darkness with a certain amount of humor. People bring up that at times. And usually when they do, I say, how closely do you read the headlines on CNN?
Yeah.
You know, from my point of view, residents aren't nearly as dark as real life. If you want to go out there and start, I just saw one yesterday. It's like manhunt for a guy who murdered his 8-month-old son.
Yeah.
It's like, the residents would never go there.
Right. Yeah. That's pretty interesting. In terms of the musical evolution and maturity of the group, can you tell us about how they have, how songs come together? How do these album concepts come together? I think you mentioned in a couple other interviews there's a new album coming about train wrecks. How do these songs come together, and what inspires some of these themes?
Honestly, it's hard to know exactly where some of these things come from. They usually just kind of, almost like they kind of appear on their own. And some things appear in a fairly intact way. I mean, the train wreck thing, there is one of the residents in particular that's always had this great fascination and love affair with trains. And it was really another one that suggested doing something with trains, because knowing how much this one loved trains, thought, well, it'd be interesting to do something about trains. But typically with residents, well, I mean, what are you just going to do about trains? Right. You have to go somewhere with it.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, sometimes these things pop up more or less intact. Other times they evolve with the creative process or with research, which can be kind of the same thing.
Right.
And with this one, okay, well, train wrecks. What can we find out about train wrecks? And what they found was a book, for want of a better term. It's really a Kindle download that is a collection of newspaper articles from the late 1800s, early 1900s. And it's called Death by Train. And ultimately, it's not just train wrecks. I mean, a lot of train wrecks in it, but it's also, people that fall on the tracks. The train runs over them, they get cut in half.
Right.
And so they started reading this book, and what they found that was particularly fascinating was the language of that era was so elegant and eloquent. But the events that they were describing were so completely horrific that the juxtaposition of the language against the events created a kind of an interesting tension. And in a lot of ways, that became, at least from the point of view of the text, became a lot of the inspiration for the lyrics. But also, too, they had also wanted to revisit, from a form point of view, they had wanted to revisit something similar to their Eskimo album. In a lot of ways, ever since Eskimo. And so the form of the Trainwreck album is closer to Eskimo probably than anything else that they've done, in that it's very multi-layered. It's a collage of music, sound effects, singing, spoken word, textural stuff. So anyway, those are the elements that sort of came together, or are in the process of coming together, to create that album.
And as a group that started out as not great musicians, has the process of writing and assembling music become more enjoyable, more sophisticated, more fulfilling, or is music now secondary, to the, as an artist, maybe you get an idea for graphics or something and you might propose that to the residents, maybe that inspires something.
Sure. I mean, they're always, just doesn't want to stay on there, does it? They're always open to inspiration. And so, I mean, if I were to do something graphically that seemed particularly inspiring to them, well, they could take that and run with it for sure.
What do you think, where do you see the residents having impact on the world today? Obviously, after several decades, they're survivors. And you said culturally you feel like things are catching up to the residents. Do you feel that the residents have had a broad impact on music, or just humanity has changed, ideas have changed?
Well, given the fact that 9 out of 10 people that you walk up to on the street will ask you, residents, who's that?
Right.
It's hard to feel like they've had a broad impact. I know they've had a significant impact on a smaller group of people, both in terms of other musicians and fans. We always said, or kind of discovered, that historically your typical Residents fan was the weird freaky nerd that couldn't relate to anybody in every little small town everywhere. And I don't know that that's quite as true as it used to be, but I do think that for the people who have found the Residents and have felt, alienated, disenfranchised, the Residents have opened a door for them. They've said it's okay to be weird and crazy and, not be trying to imitate Beyonce or Jay-Z or whatever's popular. You can kind of follow your own path, and that's okay. That's a good thing.
Yeah. And your sense as an artist, a graphic artist and somebody who uses technology, I feel like the residents pushed a lot of boundaries for many years, and your art was always, so it's always stood out. I mean, you can look at a video like Constantinople and go, nobody does art like that. Or do you feel like it is its own thing for that little crowd, and it's special as it is, you know, kind of like a gift to that small crowd?
Well, personally, I don't ever see the residents as having broad appeal. You know, they're never going to threaten Justin Bieber.
Right.
But at the same time, I've always felt that to some extent they were underexposed or underexploited. And you know, the documentary, it's going to be very interesting to see what kind of impact that has over time. Because having been to quite a few screenings of that and spoken to various people about it, the response has been great. There are an awful lot of people who, for one reason or another, happened upon a screening of it that don't know much, if anything, about the residents. And they'll talk about how inspired they were by it and how it makes them want to know more. Well, that's a great thing.
Absolutely.
So once again, it's kind of hard to know what the future's going to bring, but I do think, you know, the influence and impact of the residents, I think, will continue to grow over time.
Yeah. I read an article by David Byrne and another one by Moby about the cost of living in artistic cities like New York, and how there are cities like Florence or Venice that used to be flourishing with art, but now people just visit to take things away from and not contribute to. Do you feel, being a San Francisco-based artist, do you feel that that's happening here, or do you see that the art community is still flourishing and, you know, still thriving, doing well?
Well, to be completely honest, I've never really considered San Francisco to be much of an art center.
Really? I'm from Phoenix, so
Yeah.
compared to Phoenix.
I think LA in a lot of ways is more of an art center than San Francisco. San Francisco is a great culinary center.
Yes.
It's a great tech center.
Yeah.
But San Francisco, while I do know some great artists here, San Francisco does not particularly seem to embrace or cherish its artists. San Francisco looks towards New York or London or Paris. And why that is, I don't know. I mean, you know, Jesus famously said, "No man is a hero in his own hometown," and I think there's some of that for sure. But yeah, I think in terms of supporting an artistic community here, I think it's difficult in a lot of ways, and I think for young people, honestly, there's not much of a chance. If you're not part of the tech crowd making $150,000 a year or more, you can kind of forget it. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't find a place to live in Oakland or somewhere in the Bay Area, but it's not very easy in San Francisco at this point. But, you know, it's like Manhattan and Brooklyn or something. Young people don't go into Manhattan and get an apartment, but there are places, plenty of places in Brooklyn, and a lot of young people are there.
The residents, I think it was the 40th anniversary tour, they did the Wonder of Weird.
Right.
What is it about weird? Like, make weird music, that it's in the title of my website, but for me it's like a unique voice. What is it about the residents that they're embracing weird? What does it mean to them?
Well, honestly, from my point of view, is that they're not afraid to be themselves and afraid to be original. And you can label that weird or not. That's kind of irrelevant. I think most people don't either have the confidence or they're not bold enough to listen to their own unique voice and act on that. I think there are a handful of people out there that can listen to their own unique voice and do something that's popular. You know, I mean, if you listen to Stevie Wonder, you know, back in the 70s, I mean, the guy was just a fountain of beautiful, catchy pop music. You know, it's what Brian Wilson was in the 60s. And I don't think they were trying to be popular. I think they were just being their own unique voice. But so many people are unempowered or afraid to really be unique and original, when that's inherent in everybody. And I mean, like I say, if you want to call that weird, that's okay. But to me, it's normal.
Do you feel that you have found your own unique voice? Did you struggle with that over the years, or you've always just kind of been you and you've done what you've done?
Yeah, for the most part, for me, I suppose that came fairly easily. I mean, I can't necessarily say why. I mean, you know, as a graphic artist, when I started out, I knew that I didn't really have the chops to be able to. I mean, I was always a big MC Escher fan, and it's like, I mean, if you look at some of Escher's work and the elegance with which he would hand cut these, it's like, man, I could never do that in a million years. But on the other hand, I guess I had confidence that I could do something that was unique relative to me and who I am.
And can you tell me about that? Who are you, and how does that come out in your art?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say, other than attempting to be true to myself. It's hard to say how that comes out. I think sometimes it's more successful than others, but I think that's true of any artist. To me, the most important thing about any kind of creativity is to be open. And I feel like creativity is the process of life passing through you. So that if you are truly and genuinely open to life, you open up, life comes in, it passes through you, and in the process of passing through, you stamp it, or you flaw it, or you beat it up, and it comes out with whatever your unique sensibility is.
What do you feel are some of your works that reflect that unique sensibility most?
You know, I was always very proud of, I mean, you mentioned Tweedles, I think, earlier, and I thought that Tweedles did a very good job of, you know, at that time I was working with 3D graphics programs, particularly working with a program called Poser that is optimized for human figures. And now, I guess the program's still around, I haven't worked with it for a while, but it was optimized for human figures and then animal figures. And, you know, the whole idea of the program is that, you know, the kind of little wooden mannequins that artists have used for years to create poses. Well, this was a digital version of that, and ultimately became very sophisticated. But the program was never hugely successful, so it went from kind of like one company to another to another to another, and every time somebody would add something else, and it just got really kind of difficult to work with. But anyway, that was kind of the apex of my 3D graphics short career, and I felt very very positive about that in terms of feeling like kind of captured where I was at that time and where I felt like that album was at. Also, the Third Reich and Roll and Eskimo were things that I felt like really kind of captured where I was at and where the residents were at those moments.
I look at those pieces and they're as iconic to me as, you know, Andy Warhol's Marilyn Monroe. I just think they're incredibly unique. There's never been a piece that looked like these, and I feel like Eskimo and Third Reich, those two pieces stand out. So for me, thinking about where you might have been at that point, it's interesting because you say you've developed over the years, and you mentioned that Tweedles, which is a recent thing, is something
right.
You're very proud of, but also there's early work.
Yeah.
So that's cool,
yeah.
You know, to hear an artist say, I like stuff I used to do and I like stuff that I've done recently.
Sure. I mean, you know, to me it's an ongoing process, and I still feel like I have things to say.
Uh-huh. Do you have any more things to say? Do you feel like you've got a wellspring in you, you're highly motivated, or, you know, after 40 some years doing this, you've got a few ideas you want to get out and you'll feel good after that?
I'm still pretty motivated.
Yeah.
I'm still pretty motivated. I mean, one of the more interesting things that's happening right now is the residents God in Three Persons from 1988 is in development as a stage piece, and I'm pretty involved in that, and I'm very excited about it. I mean, you know, as time has moved on, it's kind of like they're almost like parallel lines of the residents. One, of course, is the new stuff that's still being created, but the other is continuing to sort of mine the legacy.
Right.
And
is it refreshing, that process? Like satisfying to go back and kind of articulate certain things?
For the most part, it is. I mean, I'm not someone who enjoys rehashing the past in particular, but at the same time, for God in Three Persons, the residents always felt that it was a stage piece waiting to happen, and you know, there were no resources, connections to make it happen up until like the last, say, 3 or 4 years. And so the fact that there are new people wanting to get involved, you know, director, producer, new people at, you know, this is set for a reading at ACT. ACT is the American Conservatory Theater, the longtime primary established theater group in San Francisco. So there will be a reading of God in Three Persons at ACT in September. And the fact that there are, like I say, a lot of people involved in this and excited about it, that gets me excited too.
Yeah.
So that doesn't feel like it's rehashing the past. That feels like it's giving new life to it.
Are the residents bigger than ever? Do you feel like they have a bigger following than ever, thanks to the internet, thanks to distribution that's easy to access?
I don't know. I mean, you know, if you look strictly from a sales point of view, I'd have to say absolutely not. But on the other hand, there are things that I think were more trendy at one time or another. And once again, it's like, you know, when it comes to sales, nobody sells as much as they used to.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at Michael Jackson's Thriller, what did it sell? 50 million copies, 60, 75 million copies? I mean, something that sells 2 million copies now is considered to be a big hit.
Right.
So once again, that has more to do with changes in the culture than it does to do with the residents, really. I think in terms of their hardcore following, I think they're as popular as ever. And the residents just finished a tour. They've Shadowland, the most recent show, they've done, I think, close to 55 performances of it. That's pretty successful.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah. So I suppose it just depends on how what your measuring stick is. And it's hard for me to say, really.
Well, this has been super enlightening. I'm really grateful for your time. Thank you so
Sure.
much.
Yeah.
And congratulations to you and the residents. I mean, I just think you guys are an incredible group of people, and what you're doing has had such impact on me and so many other people. And I love your art. I love the music that the residents makes. I think it's just wonderful. So thank you for doing what you and the band do.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's always nice to hear those things.
Yeah.
Sometimes you feel like you're kind of isolated, in your little studio somewhere with staring at a computer. And it's like, is there actually a world out there?
There is, man. There is a world.
Yeah.
Casey is a big fan. He's the guy behind the camera. Just want to give him an opportunity if he has a question to ask.
No, I think it was covered greatly, really. Everything's
right,
great.
cool.
Oh, one thing, Tweedles. There was talk about it being a stage show like God Be Persons. Why wasn't it ever put on tour? Was it because the timing was bad? Because it does seem destined for like a tour, I would think.
Yeah, I think it's just a timing issue. I'm trying to think what was happening. Demons Dance Alone was a big tour. I kind of think maybe that was right before Tweedles.
Yes.
And then I think the Bunny Boy was after.
Right.
And I think maybe Bunny Boy just felt like a fresher project when next time it was time to tour. But I think Tweedles could make a very interesting show.
So there's still talk of it being an actual stage show as opposed to a concert type of thing?
Yeah, I think it lends itself more to a theater piece than it does to concert. I mean, watching audience reactions to things, audience reaction to Shadowland has been pretty fantastic. And I think Shadowland is a good show. I think it's a very good show. But I think it's almost a straight ahead rock show for the residents, as compared to, say, Demons Dance Alone or, heaven forbid, the Mole Show. So my sense is that audiences now, there's so much material for people to choose from that audiences almost need things a little pre-digested and categorized. Mm-hmm. And the more you have a tendency to blur the lines of the categories, the harder it is to sell it. And I think that if you took something like Tweedles and you said, okay, this is not a rock show, this is a theater piece, and you put it in theaters, I think audiences are going to be more accepting of it than if you tried to take it into rock clubs, where people are not going to have the attention span as they do for music.
Right.
I feel like that was one of the things reaction to Bunny Boy was, in a lot of ways, was very mixed, because it was very theatrical. Whereas if you step back to Demons Dance Alone, it was theatrical but more purely musical, and I think that was a more successful tour. I mean, once again, from an audience point of view, not necessarily from my point of view.
Right. Thank you so much, Homer. I really appreciate
Sure.
it.
Yeah.
It's great talking to you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, my pleasure.
Thanks.